It was a stormy night in the small town of Millfield. John, a local resident, was driving home from work when he saw a woman standing at the side of the road, drenched from the rain. Feeling sorry for her, John pulled over and offered her a ride. The woman climbed into the back seat of his car, and John asked her where she needed to go. She gave him an address, and John started to drive. As they made their way down the deserted roads, John noticed that the woman was eerily quiet. He tried to make conversation, but she only gave short, one-word answers. When they finally arrived at the address she had given him, John turned to the back seat to tell the woman they had arrived, but she was nowhere to be found. He searched the car, but there was no sign of her. Shaken, John drove home, trying to shake off the feeling that something was wrong. But as he climbed into bed, he heard a soft whisper in his ear, "Thank you for the ride." John sat bolt upright, but there was no one there. He tried to convince himself it was just his imagination, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Over the next few nights, John was plagued by strange occurrences. Objects would move on their own, and he would hear whispers in the darkness. He tried to ignore it, but the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. One night, John woke up to find the woman from the side of the road standing at the foot of his bed. She was pale and ghostly, with eyes that seemed to glow in the darkness. John tried to scream, but no sound escaped his lips. The woman floated closer, until she was inches from his face. And then, in a flash of blinding light, she disappeared. From that night on, John refused to drive alone at night. He always felt like he was being watched, and he never forgot the terror of that stormy night in Millfield. Katie had always been fascinated by the old abandoned mansion at the edge of town. It was said to be haunted by the ghosts of the family who had once lived there, and Katie couldn't resist the lure of the unknown. One night, she convinced her friends to join her on a dare to explore the mansion. Armed with flashlights and a sense of adventure, they snuck onto the property and made their way inside. The mansion was dark and musty, with cobwebs covering the furniture and debris scattered across the floor. As they made their way through the empty rooms, they began to hear strange noises, whispers and footsteps coming from the shadows. But Katie wasn't scared. She was thrilled by the idea of encountering a ghost. So when they came across a locked door in the basement, she was the first to suggest they try to find a way in. With a bit of effort, they managed to break open the door. But what they found inside wasn't what they expected. Instead of ghosts, they found a secret laboratories filled with strange equipment and glowing vials. Suddenly, they heard footsteps approaching. Fearing they had been caught, they hid behind a nearby shelf. But it wasn't the ghost of the mansion's former occupants who had found them. It was a group of scientists. The mansion wasn't abandoned after all. It was a research facility, where they were conducting illegal experiments on human subjects. As the scientists advanced on them, Katie and her friends realized they had stumbled onto something far more terrifying than ghosts. They ran for their lives, desperate to escape the mansion and the horrors within. From that night on, Katie never sought out the unknown again. She learned the hard way that sometimes, the real monsters are the ones hiding in plain sight. Emily had always been fascinated by the abandoned amusement park on the outskirts of town. It had been closed for years, and she had heard rumors of strange happenings within its decaying walls. One day, Emily decided to explore the park on her own. She snuck past the chained gates and wandered through the empty pathways, marveling at the rusted rides and faded signs. But as she made her way deeper into the park, she began to feel like she was being watched. Every time she turned around, she saw movement out of the corner of her eye. But when she looked directly at it, there was nothing there. As the sun began to set, Emily decided to leave. But when she turned around, she saw a figure standing in front of her, a clown, with a wide, toothy grin and an ominous presence. The clown began to chase her, his laughter echoing through the empty park. Emily ran as fast as she could, but he seemed to be getting closer and closer. Just when she thought all was lost, she saw a group of teenagers approaching. They chased the clown away, and Emily was able to escape unharmed. But as she walked away from the park, she realized something strange. The teenagers who had saved her were dressed in clothing from the 1950s. It was as if they had stepped out of another era. Emily never returned to the abandoned amusement park again. She knew that something otherworldly was lurking within its walls, and she didn't want to risk encountering it again. It was a dark and stormy night when Sarah's car broke down on the side of the road. She was in the middle of nowhere, with no cell service and no other cars in sight. Desperate for help, she spotted a nearby house and decided to approach it. But as she walked up the driveway, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The front door creaked open, and Sarah stepped inside. The house was dark and musty, with cobwebs in the corners and an eerie silence filling the air. Suddenly, she heard footsteps coming from upstairs. She froze, listening as they grew louder and closer. Just as she was about to turn and run, a figure appeared at the top of the stairs. It was a man, with a twisted smile and a glint in his eye. He started to chase her, and Sarah ran through the house, searching for a way out. But every door was locked, and the windows were sealed shut. She was trapped. As the man closed in on her, Sarah suddenly woke up in her own bed, drenched in sweat. It had all been a nightmare. But when she went to turn on the light, she realized that the man from her dream was standing in the corner of the room, watching her with a cold, menacing stare. Sarah screamed, but it was too late. She was trapped once again, and there was no escape. As Sarah screamed in terror, the man slowly stepped towards her. She tried to run, but her legs felt heavy, as if they were rooted to the ground. The man reached out and touched her face, and she could feel his cold fingers against her skin. He leaned in and whispered in her ear, "You can't escape me. I'll always be with you." With a final, bone-chilling laugh, the man disappeared into thin air. Sarah was left alone in a dark and empty room, her heart racing and her mind consumed by fear. For weeks, she couldn't shake the feeling that the man was watching her, lurking in the shadows and waiting for his chance to strike again. She stopped sleeping, stopped going out at night, stopped living her life altogether. Eventually, she sought the help of a therapist, who diagnosed her with severe anxiety and PTSD. With time and treatment, Sarah learned to cope with her fears, and eventually, she was able to move on with her life. But every now and then, she would catch a glimpse of a shadowy figure out of the corner of her eye, or hear a faint, chilling laugh in the silence of the night. And she would be reminded of the man who had haunted her dreams, and who had left a permanent mark on her soul. Jenna was always fascinated by abandoned buildings. So when she heard about the old, abandoned asylum on the outskirts of town, she couldn't resist the urge to explore it. She packed a flashlight, some water, and her camera, and set out on her adventure. The building was overgrown with vines and the windows were boarded up, but she managed to find a way in through a broken door. As she made her way through the dark, empty hallways, Jenna felt a growing sense of unease. The air was thick with a musty smell, and every creak and groan of the old building seemed to echo through the halls. Suddenly, Jenna heard a sound that made her blood run cold, a faint, ghostly whisper that seemed to be coming from all around her. She tried to run, but she found herself trapped in a maze of dark corridors that seemed to shift and change around her. And then she saw them, the ghostly figures of patients, wandering aimlessly through the halls, their eyes glazed over with madness. Jenna screamed and ran, but the patients seemed to be closing in on her from all sides. Just when she thought all hope was lost, she stumbled upon a room with an old typewriter in it. Desperate for an escape, she began to type out a message, begging for help. To her surprise, the typewriter began to type on its own, forming a response to her message. The response was short and cryptic: "You are not alone. I'm with you." And then, suddenly, Jenna found herself outside the building, the sun shining down on her face. She turned around to look at the old asylum, but it was gone, vanished without a trace. Years later, Jenna still can't explain what happened that day. But she knows one thing for sure: she'll never forget the feeling of being trapped in that haunted building, with no escape in sight. Sam had always been afraid of the dark, ever since he was a child. But as he grew older, he tried to push those fears aside and be brave. One night, Sam found himself driving down a long, deserted road in the middle of nowhere. It was late, and he was exhausted from a long day of work. As he drove, he noticed that his headlights seemed to be getting dimmer and dimmer. Before he knew it, his headlights went out completely, leaving him stranded in the dark. Sam's heart raced as he tried to start the car, but the engine wouldn't turn over. He got out of the car and began to walk, hoping to find some help. But as he walked, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him from the darkness. Suddenly, he heard a low growl. He turned around to see a pair of glowing eyes staring back at him. As the creature lunged, Sam realized too late that he was face to face with a werewolf. He tried to run, but the werewolf was too fast. It knocked him to the ground and pinned him down, ready to attack. As the creature opened its jaws to bite down, Sam closed his eyes and braced for the worst. But when he opened them again, he saw something that he never would have believed possible. The werewolf had transformed into a human, and was now lying unconscious on top of him. Sam quickly got to his feet and ran, not daring to look back. Years later, Sam still can't explain what happened that night. But one thing he knows for sure: he'll never forget the terror of being face to face with a werewolf in the middle of the night. Emily always felt a little uneasy when she was alone in her apartment, but she had gotten used to it. That is, until strange things started happening. At first, it was just small things like a chair being moved or a door closing by itself. Emily tried to brush it off as her imagination, but then it started to escalate. One night, Emily was in bed when she heard footsteps in her hallway. She sat up, listening intently, but they stopped as suddenly as they started. The next night, she woke up to find her bedroom door slowly opening. She sat up in bed, frozen with fear as a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a woman with long, dark hair and sunken eyes. She moved toward Emily with a slow, deliberate gait, and Emily could feel her breath on her face. Suddenly, the woman's face twisted into a sinister grin. "I've been waiting for you," she whispered. Emily tried to scream, but her voice caught in her throat. The woman reached out and touched her forehead, and everything went black. When Emily woke up, she was lying in a hospital bed with a nurse standing over her. She tried to speak, but her voice was barely a whisper. The nurse explained that she had been found unconscious in her apartment and brought to the hospital. But when Emily told her about the woman, the nurse looked confused. "There was no woman in your apartment," she said. "Just you." Emily never went back to her apartment after that. To this day, she still has no idea what happened to her, or who the woman with the sunken eyes really was. Riley and her friends had always been interested in exploring abandoned buildings, so when they heard about an old, derelict mansion on the outskirts of town, they jumped at the chance to explore it. As they approached the mansion, they could feel a sense of unease creeping over them. The windows were boarded up and the doors were rusted shut, but they eventually found a way in through a broken window. As they explored the mansion, They couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every creaking floorboard and rustling of the wind seemed to be amplified, making them more and more anxious. Suddenly, Riley's friend Jenna let out a blood-curdling scream. The others rushed to her side to find her staring in horror at a strange figure standing in the corner of the room. It was a tall, gaunt man with sunken eyes and a twisted grin. He moved towards them slowly, his limbs jerking and twitching in a way that made them feel sick to their stomachs. Riley and her friends ran, but they soon realized that they were trapped. The mansion seemed to shift and twist around them, trapping them in a maze of hallways and rooms. As they frantically searched for a way out, they could hear the figure getting closer and closer. His laughter echoed through the halls, and they could feel his breath on their necks. Just when they thought they were trapped forever, they burst through a door and found themselves outside. They ran for what seemed like hours, not daring to look back. When they finally stopped, panting and sweating, they realized that they had no idea where they were. The landscape was twisted and distorted, like something out of a nightmare. And that's when they heard her laughter once again, echoing through the trees. They knew that they had to keep running, or else they would be trapped forever in the nightmare world of the derelict mansion. As the group huddled together in fear, they heard a sound of something moving around outside the cabin. The footsteps were heavy and deliberate, and seemed to circle the cabin before coming to a stop in front of the door. Suddenly, the door burst open and the creature revealed itself. It was a massive humanoid figure, standing at least 8 feet tall. Its skin was a sickly green color, and its eyes glowed with an otherworldly light. The creature reached out with its massive hand and grabbed one of the group members, lifting them up off the ground effortlessly. The others tried to fight back, but their efforts were futile against the creature's immense strength. Just when it seemed like all hope was lost, one of the group members remembered the old legend about the creature. According to the legend, the creature was vulnerable to fire. With nothing else to lose, the group quickly grabbed anything they could find that would burn and set the cabin ablaze. The creature shrieked in pain as it caught fire, and eventually collapsed to the ground, motionless. The group managed to escape the burning cabin and make their way back to civilization, but they would never forget the terror they experienced that night. There was a man named Jack who was an amateur astronomer. He loved nothing more than spending his nights gazing up at the stars with his trusty telescope. One night, as he was scanning the sky, he spotted something he had never seen before. It was a dark object, moving quickly through the night sky. At first, he thought it might be a satellite, but as he continued to watch, he realized that it was too big and too irregular in shape to be man-made. As he watched in awe, the object suddenly stopped in midair and began to hover directly over Jack's house. He felt a sense of unease wash over him as he continued to watch the object through his telescope. Suddenly, a beam of light shot down from the object, illuminating Jack's backyard. He watched in horror as a figure emerged from the light and began to approach him. The figure was humanoid in shape, but its skin was a sickly green color and its eyes glowed with an otherworldly light. Jack was frozen with fear as the figure came closer and closer. Just when it seemed like the creature was about to grab him, Jack snapped out of his trance and ran inside his house, locking the door behind him. He quickly called the police and reported what he had seen. When the police arrived, they found no evidence of the creature or the UFO. Jack was left feeling shaken and traumatized by the experience, and he never used his telescope again. But every night, as he lay in bed, he could still feel the creature's eyes on him, watching and waiting for its next chance to strike. It was a dark and stormy night, and Jennifer was all alone in her big, creaking house. Her husband was away on a business trip, and her kids were staying over at their grandparents' house. Jennifer was feeling restless, so she decided to go down to the basement to sort through some old boxes and see if there was anything she wanted to donate to charity. As she made her way down the stairs, she felt a chill run down her spine. She brushed it off as just a draft and continued down to the basement. The musty smell of old cardboard hit her nose as she started to dig through the boxes. She found some old clothes and toys that her kids had outgrown, but nothing of real value. That's when she heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from behind one of the boxes. She froze, her heart racing. She tried to tell herself that it was just a mouse or a rat, but the sound was too loud and too deliberate to be an animal. She cautiously approached the box, and as she peeked behind it, she saw a pair of glowing eyes staring back at her. They belonged to a figure crouched behind the boxes. Jennifer was frozen with fear as the figure started to crawl towards her. She couldn't see its face, but she knew it was not human. She tried to scream, but her voice was caught in her throat. The creature was inches away from her face when suddenly the lights turned on, and her husband walked into the basement. He had come home early from his business trip, and had decided to surprise her. Jennifer collapsed onto the floor, her heart pounding with relief. She couldn't believe how scared she had been over nothing. But as she looked back at the spot where the creature had been, she saw that there were scratch marks on the wall, and the faint smell of sulfur in the air. She couldn't explain it, but she knew that something had been down there with her, something that was not of this world.